we're here with Stephen Nowlin, um, an artist who is going to have a show in a few days at the Mount Wilson Observatory in Los Angeles Crest Forest or Angeles Crest Forest. Art Rep DG is really happy to be able to talk with Stephen. I have actually known Stephen for more years than I wish to count. Um, and we worked together on curating a show for Robert Morris, which was, I think, really fun. But when you hear Stephen talk, you'll know that that was just like one of many amazing shows and exhibitions that he's been a part of. So, that being said, I would start by saying, hi, Stephen, welcome. It's great to see you.
Hi,
And
Debbie. Thank you for having me.
oh, it's great. I think what I'd like to do is start with just like a little bit of background, and then we'll talk about the show that's coming up, and we'll go from there. What do you think?
Hey, sounds
Good.
good.
So, there were things that I didn't really know about your origin story. Tell me about your background a little.
My my background, you mean like from the beginning?
Yes, because
From the beginning.
yeah, because I'm not gonna blow the surprise, but I will actually. I didn't know. I'll ask you this question. I didn't know that your parents were professional musicians.
Oh yeah. Well, so I grew up in LA and just sandwiched between Alhambra and El Sereno and South Pasadena in a wonderful neighborhood that had this was in the late 50s, early 60s, to date myself. And it was full of hot rodders. As some of it was really a very cool neighborhood. And one of my early influences was these, 10 years, 15 years older than me, um, young men in the neighborhood who were building hot rods and customizing cars. And these guys grew up to be some of the recognized pioneers of Southern California hot rodding. So that was an early influence. And also, as you said, my parents were musicians. I was listening to music in the womb and thereafter because they were practicing their instruments. They were classical musicians and they were practicing their instruments all hours of the day. And so I just grew up with that heavy influence, and it has stuck with me. Um, I didn't learn to play an instrument myself, but the influence of that music has been with me. And even if it can't be sort of seen, if it's not foregrounded in my work, it as a visual artist, it is certainly still there.
Well, I would imagine that having parents who were musicians or in the arts, that it made it a little bit easier for you to pursue a life in the arts.
Yeah, I think they were hesitant, as probably most parents are,
Hmm.
uh, with the idea of being an artist because they knew what the struggle was like. They were successful and had good careers, but there were many musicians that they knew who weren't. And so, but they never discouraged me, and they encouraged me to pursue the visual arts. But I always suspected that they kind of wondered, where it would take me.
Sure, sure. Well, so tell us about how you sort of, where you studied, how you sort of moved into the visual arts, because I know you have a lot of degrees and a lot of training. So talk a little bit about that.
Well, I I ended up going to four colleges. Actually um, I applied at age 17 in high school. I applied to Art Center College and was rejected, and was crushed by that rejection, um, because I'd sort of set art center up as my goal, as a sort of test of whether I had what it took to be an artist. And at the time, they didn't accept high school students. So, well, I later learned that that wasn't such a horrible thing, but at the
Right.
time, I thought it was. Um, but then I went to California College of the Arts, which back then was called California College of Arts and Crafts. Um, and it was great. It was in Berkeley. It was in at the second half of the 60s. It was a happening place, and I was in the middle of it, and I enjoyed it all. But at the same time, I was exposed in the Bay Area to a lot of very avant-garde art and technology, Merce Cunningham, uh, John Cage, happenings. I rented time at the Mills College Music Center, a tape music center, which was a pioneering electronic music um, mecca
You're right.
in all of the United States, and
Were
they
you
were
there?
trying.
I'm sorry, was Bob Ashley there when you were there? Robert Ashley?
I don't remember a lot of names. They were, trying to keep this lab alive by renting it out to people who were interested in fooling around with. At that time, it was a Buchla synthesizer, not a Moog synthesizer. And some of my art center, rather my CCAC colleagues and I rented time from them and messed around with electronic music. But all this avant-garde stuff that I was exposed to was not being taught at CCAC. And after a couple of years, I felt like I needed to move on. So I came back to LA. And when I got back, I got a job building models in an architectural firm. And turned out it was the architect who had designed California Institute of the Arts. And uh, that was just sort of the place I needed. So I learned about Cal Arts by building a model of it, and then went there and completed my bachelor's degree. And then 6 years later, after getting married and thinking I needed to get serious about my art career, I decided to get my MFA, and I went to Art Center for that. So I spread it out over 4 colleges.
You got your degree in painting from Art Center?
Well, I changed my major about as many times as I changed colleges. I started out, I think, as illustration and then switched to printmaking. And at Art Center for an MFA, I was a painting major. At Cal
So
Arts, at Cal Arts, I was a design major.
yeah, I understand that. So, one of the things that I should have said when I first introduced you is that I knew you as the vice president, curator of exhibitions at Art Center, that you spent, I think, maybe over 30 years curating the exhibitions for the Williamson galleries. That's right. So, how did you go from um, painting to curating? And I understand that you like graduated from Art Center with your MFA, but within weeks you were teaching at Art Center. So how did Art Center sort of help, or how did it mold you into, being a painter and then being a teacher and then being a curator? So-
Well, at the time, I think I just kind of got lucky, and Art Center hired me right after I graduated to start teaching classes and to work in the admissions office. And Art Center was a smaller place. Uh, and Anybody who was there would probably get other kinds of duties and asked tacked on to what they were actually hired to do. And after being there for a year or so, I was asked to start helping them put together shows in their. They didn't have a gallery space. It was a studio space that was shared by the transportation department, transportation design department, and half of each semester we used it as a gallery. And so I started just helping install things, and pretty soon, it happens this way. You start doing something like that, and then you kind of become indispensable. and
Right.
and then because you've enabled them by being indispensable and by being there and being willing, you've enabled them to do more ambitious projects. And then pretty soon they're stuck with you uh, because they can't do it without you anymore. So from there, it evolved into um, eventually building the Williamson Gallery, which was completed in 1992. And from then on, I became the director of the Williamson Gallery and curated, um, I don't know, 150 shows, maybe,
Mhm.
uh, a lot of them on design. Uh,
Yeah, clearly, my experience, and clearly, you had a gift for curating. There were some pretty interesting shows that went on there. And so, did you find that, or did you continue making art while you were making exhibitions?
I did, and I kept showing my work in LA, and I had a gallery, and um, was in group shows, and showed at the Municipal Art Gallery, Josine Yankel Sterl's,
Hmm.
in some shows, and I had work in the rental gallery at LACMA, and I did all the things that a young recent MFA does to try to get their work known. Um, and I did that well into the late 90s, but also in 95, I curated my first art and technology show. And
Uh,
yeah,
Yeah,
it's
so how,
called,
yeah, that was my question. How did it kind of, go from this design into the technology end of things?
so I'd always had this interest in art and science, art and technology. To back up just a little bit, before I went to Cal Arts, and after I had worked for the architect who built Cal Arts, I left that job and got a job at Caltech in the astronomy department. And at the time, Caltech had a program um, of visiting artists working with scientists. And I'd heard about this program and I wanted to be involved. I wasn't a known artist, so the only way I could get involved was to go get a job there. So I did. And I got to work with a lot of scientists in that way. So it had always been an interest of mine. And when I curated that first uh, show in 1995 for the Williamson Gallery, it was called Digital Mediations. I co-curated it with Erki Hutamo at UCLA. And uh, it just brought back this sort of interest that I'd always had in that subject, resonated with all the things that I'd seen back when I was in Berkeley, and that really got me excited and caused me to leave CCAC. Um, so I kept doing them, and over a period of time, uh, I switched. Really, I kind of morphed from doing art and technology shows. I realized that technology for me was a symbol of science, and that I was less interested in the technology part of it, i.e., media art, that was just about media as a new and exciting palette for artists. I was more interested in really getting at the science underneath all the technology. And so I began doing art and science shows, and curating these shows kind of became my art practice. And I stopped painting much, and took on took on doing these shows like one a year for the next 20 years. Um, uh,
Well, it's interesting. I was thinking about this, is that, um, and this is really reducing it to the lowest common denominator, but I think like when you talk about science and technology, you're talking about facts. And when you're talking about art, you're talking about ideas. Would you agree that that's a basis for discussion?
uh,
No.
well, yeah, I guess I agree with that statement. My interest in art and science was that art was bringing to science some of the poetic dimensions, was able to express some of the poetic dimensions of science, which science itself was not very good at doing. And so that's very much what I wanted to bring out in the shows that I was curating. And I very soon realized the difference between a science museum and an art museum that engages with science. And so, what I didn't want to do was present a history of science or
Mm,
present the mechanics of science. I didn't want it to be a didactic, pedagogical experience. I wanted
mhm.
it to be an immersive, experiential way of understanding science. And that was to see it through the lens of artists who saw in science more of a poetic, transcendent dimension. Transcendent is a tricky word. To some people, transcendence means like a word, some kind of a wormhole to the supernatural. That's not how I meant it at all. But I meant an emotional experience of science. And so that's what those shows were based on.
Um, what was your favorite show that you did during all those years? Combining your interest in technology and art. Do you have a favorite?
Yeah, that's a tough one. As it turns out, the old cliche, the last one I did, that,
Right.
that works for me. The last, but it's pretty hard to describe a favorite. But the last show I did was called Sky, and it was the only show where I took to the sort of extreme that I'd always thought I wanted to do by not putting up any labels at all. I wanted it to be a sort of an alloy of science and art where the two were indistinguishable and where there was absolutely no didactic material whatsoever to distinguish between them. And it worked out great. The only problem was that it was uh, opened in 2020, in February of 2020, and closed 3 weeks later.
Yeah. Did
Forever,
something happen in February of 2020?
forever because of COVID. So that was too bad. We did do a lot of virtual interaction because of it being closed with the show stayed up then instead of staying up for the 4 months that I had planned it. It just stayed up for a year and a half because there was no reason to, no one was coming to the gallery. There was no reason to take it down. So we kind of used it as a stage for doing a lot of um, online access. One of them being Sky Stories, where we went to JPL and Caltech, and we got connected with three young astrophysicists, all of them women, and they came in to the gallery, into the Sky gallery, and in with the exhibition in the background, they told their stories about how they came to science as young women. And it's online. You can find it. You just
That's cool.
maybe if you Google sky stories and Art Center or Williamson Gallery, you'll find them. They're little like 3.5 minute vignettes, beautifully done. In fact, they won an award um, in the in a science film festival.
Oh, really?
Trying to remember the name of the film festival, but they're very well done, and you'd enjoy them, and you get to see some of the sky show in the background.
That's cool. I think that I had a huge interest in Robert Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project and, physicists and all of those things that happened. I mean, I was always interested in it from a cultural point of view, um, as well as the sort of obvious things. So when I hear about women in astrophysics or whatever, I'm keenly interested in that because um, when I was in school, um, that was never an option. When
Mhm.
I was in school, I remember when I started school, college, they said that year, which I won't say, had the largest number of women in colleges ever. So that kind of tells you and while I was there on my grad program, they started a women's studies program, which was radical, to do that in the 70s. Absolutely radical. That being said, I love that idea about women being astrophysicists, but more than that, what I love is that being in Pasadena and being a hometown kid and being at Art Center, that gave you like an entree into the other pretty interesting institutions that happen to be in Pasadena, like Caltech, JPL, the Huntington Library. Um, I think that that just doesn't happen. You just can't sort of. I couldn't go to JPL and said, "Hey, I'd like to talk to your female." I mean, so I think that more than being in the right place at the right time, it's the right person. I think that you were kind of this was what you should be doing. You were the person that should be doing this kind of work. That's clear. My question is, how was it received when you did these shows at Art Center? How did people respond?
I think the response was good. It's Art Center College of Design. Design is aptly described as um, art at the inter intersection of science. That's what and technology. That's kind of what design is. And so, even though they weren't about design with quotes around it, um, they were a lot about design thinking and the reception to them seemed to be positive and and enthusiastic overall. They weren't the only shows I did, and I only did one per year, and I did a lot of other kinds of shows in between, design shows and other art shows as fine art shows as well. So it wasn't all we did at Art Center.
Talk about your collaboration with scientists and other artists when you were doing these shows.
Yeah, I had a great opportunity with Caltech being so close by, and for the worlds of those two academic institutions kind of overlapping. Um, and I did a couple of what you might think of in the early 2000s sort of case study shows of artists collaborating with scientists. One of them was called Neuro. We did it with the Center for Neuromorphic Systems Engineering at Caltech. Uh,
Oh,
they were looking into how um, animals and living things humans and animals and other living things sense and make sense of the world, and trying to design machines and computers that would uh, biomimic the ways that living things do it. They're trying to understand the relationship between those two things. And so it was a very exciting kind of lab doing this work at the forefront of engineering and science. And so they had some money from the National Science Foundation that included an obligation to do outreach. And I discovered that in the science world, if you find a laboratory that has money and required money for science and a required outreach budget, and you have a principal investigator who is, you know, willing to think outside of the box, that it may be that you can do an art exhibition as an outreach um,
Hmm.
product of science outreach. And I was lucky. I found a couple of over the years. I found a couple of labs at Caltech that would do that, and we did this show where we brought with that we called Neuro, and we brought together five contemporary artists with the scientists in that laboratory, and they got to know each other and they collaborated, and it ended up with all new works, all works that came out of the discourse and dialogue between the artists and scientists. Then that was in 2003, and then 5 years later, in 2008, we did another one with the Spitzer Space Telescope Center at Caltech, in which we also brought together, I think at that time, six artists with scientists at the Spitzer Science Center. And we did the same kind of thing, artworks based on the science uh, that uh, that were new mostly installation-based artworks in the Williamson Gallery. So those
Wow.
those were successful, and then they were successful for me, I thought. And we did catalogs for both of them, and I think the science side were happy with the outcome. The National Science Foundation even put up a website on their own for Neuro. Um, I don't think it's still up, but it was. And out of that came, a lot of sort of offshoots of that with Caltech, with JPL, um, with other science organizations around the country that helped provide content for those
That,
shows.
that's really cool. That's really cool. Before we start talking about your Mount Wilson show, I was wondering if you would talk about what I call the Feynman story, because I think that's just the best story ever. And would you mind telling us that story?
Yeah, that that story comes out of back in 1971 when I was working at Caltech. Um, and so, one of uh, the sort of polarities that exists in the science and art world is that the scientists are not always interested in art the way the artists are, and the artists really want to get their hands on the technology. And so sometimes there's a bit of a schism between the two. And when you can find projects like the ones I just described, where everybody's kind of on the same page about coming together, it's great. Um, in the program that I was a part of, the art and science program at Caltech back in early 1970, they had not only scientists, or rather artists, who came there to get their hands on the science and the technology, but they also had a portion of that program that was just sort of traditional art for scientists who'd had enough of technology. They wanted to get away from technology and get into the bohemianism of of more traditional arts. And Richard Feynman was one of those. I mean, was a genius in many ways, not just his science, but he was also an artist. But he was an artist who drew and who drew the figure and who wanted to be in those classes. Whereas me, a young 20-year-old student artist, just wanted to mess with oscilloscopes and computers. Um, but I met him and we knew each other just as acquaintances. Uh, I don't know if he had won his Nobel Prize at the time. I certainly remember being told he was an important scientist. Um, but one day we passed in the hallway and we nodded hello, and he was on his way. Well, I was on my way to the computer lab, and he was on his way to draw figures like Degas. And it was just for me this sort of symbol of that two cultures kind of schism that exists in the science and art worlds. Later on, I read a lot even after he died, and I've done works based on Feynman and uh, acquired a much greater appreciation for him as an artist. He was not a backwards thinking person at all. He was very much a forward thinking person, and he wrote beautifully, and he remains as one of my heroes.
That's great. I love that story, and I love that story for how you just described it. And it's yeah, it's a moment in one's life, I think.
Yes, yes.
Um, how did your interest in the galaxy and and all of that, how did the work that you're showing at Mount Wilson, how did you sort of arrive at doing doing these works, yeah, and can you describe the sort of the three parts of the new work that's going to be at Mount Wilson and the work that you've been working on for a while, which I know one of my favorite pieces incorporates writing by Feynman, so it's a good segue. But how did that sort of, move from technology to outer space?
Um, well, just sort of back up just a little bit. When I was curating these art science exhibitions at the Williamson Gallery, I was fond of putting artifacts of science right next to art and displaying them in the same way so that there were no sort of boundaries between the two. And one of the ways I did that was to go over to the Huntington Library and rummage through their rare book collection and in and for old science books, for 400-year-old science books, some of them unknown to me or known to scholars, I'm sure, but unknown to the general public. But some of them famous books, like Copernicus's book and
Oh, wow.
Galileo's books, and as I'm looking through these books, I'm finding these amazing engravings of astronomical phenomenon, um, engravings incorporating the sort of mixture of religious iconography and astronomical iconography. Um, and so I would have the Huntington scan those pages, give me high resolution scans of those engravings. And then I would take them to the copy center at Art Center, where they have huge, big inkjet printers, and I would print them huge, large. And display them in the gallery as artifacts of science. And the work I've been doing since in the last 3 years that is in the Mount Wilson show is all based on it's all archival pigment printing. It's all on big, huge, in my case, a big, huge Epson printer. And the desire to do that came straight out of the work that I'd done as a curator at Art Center. So uh, you know, the the imagery that's coming back from space telescopes and from spacecraft that have been sent out to explore other bodies is really exciting stuff. It's imagery. I mean, it kind of boggles my mind that we in the last 20 years are seeing things that no humans ever saw before us. All they ever saw of of Jupiter and the moons of Jupiter and Saturn and the other planets were tiny little dots. And if they looked at them through telescopes, they were basically bigger dots. Even with modern telescopes, they were fuzzy balls rather than dots. We really hadn't seen anything in all of human history. It's mind-boggling. And in the last 20 years, this stuff is raining down on us. A lot of it's going through JPL, and we get it, and it's out there, and it's in archives. And so I started looking at all these archives and was just fascinated by the things that were there that essentially were landscapes. Uh,
Right.
I mean,
Right.
the pictures of Jupiter. Jupiter is not a landscape; it's a gas scape. But the pictures that came from rovers on Mars were landscapes.
Mm.
Other pictures that have orbited moons of Jupiter, moons of Saturn, um, have given us back landscapes. And so I have all this access to all this um, really photographic material, and I have a technology which is Epson printing to work with those, and to work with the content that I find in ancient science books. And so all of that stuff starts getting sort of mixed up in my visual mind as to how I could, play with this amazing content. And so the work at Mount Wilson comes out of that sort of milieu of of me being interested in pursuing these opportunities that are there. I mean, it's not like you have to have a special pass. I mean, you do have to have a special pass to through rare books at the Huntington, but a lot of it is extremely accessible. Not very much of it is of the older stuff is high resolution, which is a problem for an artist because you want high resolution if you want to do anything at any scale. Um, but there's now technologies to upscale and compensate for low resolution. And the stuff they're getting back from Mars, from the rovers, is all pretty high resolution. And so that's that's my palette is these this access to all of these wonderful things. And you're right about sort of being in the right place at the right time. There's some serendipity there. Pasadena is just the center of the world. JPL is the center of the solar system, as far as I'm concerned. And they're all there. And over the years, I got to know enough people there to sort of worm my way into having some access to them.
So, how did you get hooked up with Mount Wilson to have an exhibition? And after that, how did you hook up with Rebecca Mendez, who a brilliant artist who you're showing with? How did that come about?
Well, just in my travels around the Pasadena, Southern California science world, I got to know people at Mount Wilson, uh, and our paths crossed in various different ways. And when I left my full-time position at Art Center, uh, I, kept in touch with Mount Wilson, and Dan Coney at Mount Wilson is doing all these amazing cultural programs there, concerts, lectures, art exhibitions, and I knew about them and attended some of them, and um, Dan and I were in touch with each other, and he asked if I would be in and curate a show for Mount Wilson. And I told him I didn't want to curate shows anymore, but that I would do a two-person show. And so he said, okay.
Hmm.
And, and Rebecca and I had done ambitious projects together for for many years. She was in a number of my shows. We tromped around the in the mountains of Pasadena once looking for burnt firewood for an installation of hers. I shut down the whole campus twice with a fire alarm because putting we were putting volcanic um, dirt into one of her installations, and the dust set off the fire alarms.
Oh my God.
So Rebecca and I go back, and and we've worked successfully together. She's a consummate professional, and I know if she says yes to something, it's going to happen. And so I said, "Would you like to do this?" And she immediately said yes. And so that's how we got together.
So let's talk about some pieces that people are going to see in the show.
Yeah.
Um, so again, you sort of separated into three categories of
Yeah.
interest.
You want me to mention those categories?
I do.
So, so they are three categories. One is called This Land, the other is called Marginalia, and then the third is called Chronicles of Fallacy. This land has to do with all the astronomical imagery that I've been describing, um, as sort of a continuation of art's involvement with and fascination for forever with landscape. I mean, these are landscapes, and so so juxtap and my particular interest is in juxtaposing different landscapes with the landscape that we all know and our own sort of and are provincially minded about, which is our own Earth landscape. But once you begin to juxtapose them with landscapes from other planets or moons, and you see the similarities, it sort of, I don't know, recharges your perspective on what we have always thought of as landscape.
Which
And so
which
that,
I would say is actually mind blowing. I mean, when you really start to think about it, like the piece, this land that has the organ pipe and Mars, uh, it, it's I mean, it's unbelievable. It's
yeah,
unbelievable that it could be so similar, or that, like you were saying, our sort of provincial way of thinking about things that we never would have imagined that it would be so similar.
yeah, that's that's exactly what I was looking at to kind of disrupt our sort of conventional thinking about something like landscape.
Right.
and also to kind of get us out of the habit of thinking that we're the center of the universe. I mean, we know that we know we're not, but still, it's hard to every day think, oh, I'm not on the flat Earth. We know we're not flat Earths, but we sort of think flat Earth still anyway. That we're on a sphere floating through a vacuum of space, and that we're in an extremely thin biosphere. I mean, the part of the atmosphere that we can survive in is only about 6 or 7 miles deep
Mm,
above
mm,
the surface of the earth. Um, so just sort of establishing our sense of who we are and what our planet is. That's what the This Land series is, and a bigger appreciation for what's out there and how similar it is to us and how similar we are to it, and that we are aliens to just as anything out there is alien. Anything living out there is an alien to us. We're aliens to whatever lives out there.
sure.
Um, and then there's the Marginalia series, which came right out of the books that I was in one of the shows I did with one of my frequent co-curators, John David O'Brien, was called Pages. And we took a lot of books and scans of books from the Huntington Library for that show. And I looked in particular in that show, I think it was like 2004, 10 or something that, or 2016 maybe. I looked for books that had marginalia in them, where people had written in the margins of books and essentially created a dialogue with what the author of the book was presenting to the public. And they were transforming the book page, at any rate, into this discourse that went way beyond simply the author's discourse. Um, and so in the Marginalia series, I began uh, finding pages from mostly rare books on science and philosophy and religion, and adding my own marginalia. And it was not only marginalia in text, but it was our marginalia in paint. And I sort of expanded the definition of marginalia to include anything that I messed with on the page as being sort of my form of marginalia. And the pieces you described, the piece you described that has it, it's a it's not exactly from a rare book, but it's a rare manuscript of a musical score by Charles Ives called "The Unanswered Question," and it's overlaid with a quote by Richard Feynman and a poem by Walt Whitman. So that's kind of what the Marginalia series does: is it resurrects old ancient um, books and imagery and adds my contemporary sort of editorial to it.
And I would sort of add that people can see the piece sort of behind you on their left. It's one of my favorite pieces, and as I told you when we were talking about it, it's one of my favorite poems. When I heard the learned astronomer speak, is one of my favorite all-time poems. For me to sort of see the Feynman and the poem and the Ives, it's just like for me, that's just a perfect piece. It's just so beautiful. And I think when people see that, I think they'll have the same response. It's just a really thoughtful, gorgeous piece. So I love that piece.
And
Absolutely love it. So let's talk about Chronicles of Fallacy.
so again, as I would peruse these old books, particularly the the science and the religion books, and the philosophy books too. Not that I'm a philosopher. I don't really know anything about philosophy, but you could tell when people are trying to sort of fake it Um, and you can tell that in books that are 400 years old. Uh, and there are 400-year-old books that present science that was never science, but was presented as science of the time. There's religious books and witchcraft books and um, paranormal books and bad medicine books that are
Mm.
300 or 400 years old that that all presented fallacies as the truths of their time. And so that series is made up of scans that I read of book covers or pages from books that present these fallacies as the truths of their time, overlaid with my own, again, interventions or disruptions in paint or text. Um, and so they're smaller pieces, and together they're called Chronicles of Fallacy.
How would you place your work within like the broader history of art or artists who engage in science? Um, where would you place this work? I mean, I think the work obviously is gorgeous. But how would you talk about where you see your work in the great scheme of things?
Yeah, that's a harder one.
You're welcome.
um, my work is, um, as I said before, very much about finding the poetic dimensions of science, and I think there's a lot of uh, um, artists who engage science in their work who are doing a much um, uh, more socially conscious kind of practice. They're trying to inform people through the lens of their art uh, about ecology, about the environment, about climate change. Of course, is a big issue that many artists are engaging with now. And um, but my work is more really about science. And why is science important? Why is it important for art to engage with science? And what does it mean? And not to repeat what I said earlier, but the uh, the interest in art and technology really evolved in in the United States anyway, through in about mid 20th century with experiments in art and technology. And it was really about artists finding kind of a new palette, a new way of making visual phenomena and exploring technology and using technology as that palette. And in the process, being able to embed commentary on industrial uh, growth and industrial impact on the environment and that sort of thing. But it was really about more about technology. And I think, and then it was kind of about media art. It was about just finding all sorts of media. And then when computers came along, it was all about digital art. And it all kind of gets lumped into art and science. But a lot of it is really not about science as a way of understanding the world, as a lens through which to contemplate one's own existence and one's own being. And so in my work, I'm trying to so target that more than the technology part, um, or the sort of social activism part of it. Um, so it's more about understanding transcendence,
Yeah.
uh, and how it's not a wormhole to the supernatural, that the supernatural is a myth, it's a fiction, but it still captures the attention and beliefs most
So
of the human population, but you can find those transcendent qualities without having to have all the hocus pocus. So, and without turning your engagement in science into some sort of quasi pseudoscience.
let
But
me,
go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, let me ask you this. This is sort of a Jeopardy question, I guess. Do you think there's life on other planets?
Oh, yeah, certainly, certainly. There can't not be. Yes, I do. And it's just it's not like a wishful thing. It's because we have evidence here on Earth of life that exists in extremely harsh, sort of awful conditions that we could never exist.
Wait,
Most
that would that be like being 118 degrees in Phoenix?
Yeah, yeah, like everybody in Phoenix. If they can live in Phoenix, then probably they could live on Mars.
Right there, you see.
But
Um,
but also when you say life, we don't is life out there? Is life that looks like us out there? Who knows? I
yeah.
would guess they've discovered thousands of exoplanets and really just the last from the with the Kepler telescope in the last 7, 8 years, thousands of planets orbiting other stars in the habitable zone. And who knows what's there, but other lives, other forms of primitive life, it exists here on this planet. There's there's no reason to to say that it couldn't exist in similar harsh conditions on other planets.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, as you sort of look over your career, is there some one thing that you're sort of the most proud of, or the best thing that you were sort of involved with? Is there one thing that stands out?
And not one, I guess not one thing. No.
But
I mean, there were those really formative years, but everybody has those formative years when you're 18 to 25 and you're just an adult and I was lucky I got some breaks and uh, the year and a half or so I spent at Caltech working with these amazing people and working in the astroelectronics lab, working with the pioneer filmmaker John Whitney, and um, getting my first real taste of the science world and what it was like. That was standout. Yeah.
well, as somebody who's worked with you, that was a highlight for me. Working on Bob Morris's show
Oh
was
yeah.
really a really great experience.
Yeah, and your question because of our conversation automatically goes to the art and science stuff. But working with Bob Morris, working with James Rosenquist, working with Judy Pfaff, working with Saul LeWitt, um, you know, that those were highlights. I mean, and
Yeah,
what a learning curve for a young artist and curator to have that experience.
I agree. I also worked with Jim Rosenquist. And you know, those are just one of those once in a lifetime or twice in a lifetime. It's just one of those experiences that, you just think, wow, how did I get here? How did I get here? And I guess that's some of the questions that your work asks as well. Like, how did I get here and where are we going? But I know it's really great to have those opportunities and something like whatever it is that led us to that. It's really like a great time to be making art, I think, and to be working in the art world because right now I think, the art world and the science world for you, but I mean, we always are sort of looking for our tribe. And more than ever, I think we need to sort of, gather our tribe together because the world is sort of so crazy. So, I totally understand what you're saying, even if I'm not as eloquent as you are in saying it. But I want to say that your show of Sand and Sky is going
Sea
to
and
be
Sea and Sky.
in Sky. That's right. Of Sea and Sky is going to be at the Mount Wilson Observatory opening July 20th from 1 to 5 p.m. and it closes.
October 20th is
Oh,
the advertised closing date.
and
And it's just to open on after the opening on the 20th, it will be open on Saturdays and Sundays throughout the summer.
by appointment also. If somebody wants to see it, can they contact you?
Well, yes, probably.
Yeah,
I
is
don't.
that
Yeah, yes. I mean, yes, by appointment, but there's no guarantee that a person, myself or other, will be available necessarily, to make appointments. But
okay? So that being the case, if people want to see the work, they can look on my website, artrepdg.com, under the collective, where you'll see Stephen Nowlin's name. And they can also look at your website, which is stephennowlin.com.
.com.
And if you want to see the work, you should go to Mount Wilson and see the work. Um, and the work is fantastic, and I can't wait for the opening next week. And I can't thank you enough for this interview. It was great and poetic. And, I'll see you in Los Angeles in a few days. So thank you so much, Stephen Nowlin. It was just my great honor to interview you in this way. And I will talk to you soon. Go see the show, Mount Wilson Observatory, Angeles Crest Forest, Los Angeles, Stephen Nowlin and Rebecca Mendez. And bye, everybody.
Thanks, Debbie. You're the
Oh,
best.
you're welcome.